By the time the courtroom emptied and my parents walked past me without recognition, something essential inside me had already died. Not hope, not love, but the version of myself that believed survival meant endurance rather than calculation. I had lost more than time and money. I had lost the last illusion that family was a shelter instead of a hunting ground. And the humiliation didn't explode inside me the way people expect. It settled, heavy and quiet like wet concrete around my chest, numbing my hands, slowing my thoughts, forcing me to watch my own life from a distance as if it belonged to someone weaker. The rage was there, but it didn't scream. It cataloged, it memorized, it learned. And while the judge's dismissal should have felt like justice, all I felt was the irreversible understanding that they had been willing to erase my future, my identity, my name without hesitation. And that meant something fundamental about the rules had changed forever. I left that building knowing I would never confront them emotionally, never seek closure, never explain myself again. Because from that moment on, I wasn't trying to survive what they did to me. That was the moment I started preparing for what would come after. I replayed the betrayal the way some people replay accidents, slowly, obsessively, from angles I didn't know existed at the time. What I saw was simple enough. My parents sitting side by side in court, my mother's hands folded just tightly enough to tremble, my father leaning forward like a man wronged by the universe. What I felt was harder to name. It wasn't anger at first. It was dislocation, a sense that I had stepped into a version of my life that had been written by someone else and handed to me without consent. And what I didn't say, that's what echoes the loudest now. I didn't ask them why. I didn't remind them of nights I skipped meals so I could pay my own rent. I didn't expose the years I sent money quietly so they wouldn't feel ashamed. I sat there calm, composed, almost polite, while something structural inside me fractured beyond repair. Outwardly, I was controlled. I answered only when spoken to. I nodded at my solicitor. I kept my breathing steady. Inside, everything was collapsing in slow motion. Each accusation landed like a measured insult, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed something I had refused to believe, that my parents had rehearsed this. The pauses, the tears, the language, none of it was spontaneous. This wasn't desperation, it was strategy. And the most disturbing detail, the one that only surfaced later, was realizing they had filed the claim weeks before my grandmother's funeral, while standing beside me as I lowered the only person who ever protected me into the ground. I pretended not to notice the satisfaction flicker across my father's face when their lawyer spoke about entitlement. I pretended not to notice my mother watching the judge instead of me, gauging performance instead of grief. I pretended I was still their son. That pretending cost me something permanent, not trust, identity. Because once you see your own parents attempt to legally erase you, you never fully return to who you were before that knowledge. What they took wasn't my apartment or my business. Those survived. What they took was my ability to see my past as real. Every childhood memory became suspect. Every sacrifice rebranded as leverage. Even my success felt contaminated, like something I had unknowingly built on land that was always going to be claimed. I walked out of court cleared legally, but internally displaced, stripped of the narrative that had carried me through my life. The shock didn't fade when I got home. It followed me into silence. I sat on the edge of my bed that night and realized I had no one to call, no family left to debrief with, no voice that existed purely on my side. That's when the numbness arrived. Not relief, not sadness, but a clean emotional shutdown. My body functioned, my mind observed, my heart went quiet. And in that quiet, something colder replaced it. I started replaying smaller moments I had ignored before, the questions about my savings disguised as concern, the comments about owing them for raising me, the way my grandmother insisted I keep records, always records, as if she had seen this coming long before I had. The betrayal didn't begin with the lawsuit. The lawsuit was just the final step in a plan that had been forming for years, patiently, invisibly, while I believed in loyalty. That realization hit me harder than the court papers ever did. This wasn't a sudden moral failure. It was a long-term assessment. They had evaluated me as an asset, waited for the return to be worth the risk, and moved when the numbers made sense. That understanding didn't make me cry. It made me very still. What would you do if the humiliation didn't end when you walked away? Because mine didn't. It followed me into my work, into my sleep, into the way I introduced myself to strangers. I was no longer someone building a future. I was someone recovering from an attempted erasure. And recovery, I learned quickly, is not the same as forgiveness. Recovery is adaptation. By the end of that week, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Accidents feel chaotic. This felt deliberate. Every step they took had been designed to corner me emotionally, financially, psychologically. They hadn't just tried to take what I owned. They had tried to redefine who I was. And once I accepted that truth, one final realization settled in, heavy and undeniable. This wasn't something that happened to me. This was something that had been planned.
After the case was dismissed, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No apology, no explanation, no aftermath worth mentioning. My parents didn't spiral or collapse the way people imagine villains do. They relaxed. They told relatives the case had been a misunderstanding. They framed the loss as generosity, how they had chosen not to pursue me further. I watched from a distance as they returned to normal routines, dinners out, quiet weekends, the soft confidence of people who believe the danger has passed. That was the first mistake. They assumed the courtroom had been the end of the story. They assumed silence meant exhaustion. I stayed invisible on purpose. I didn't confront them. I didn't block them. I didn't make dramatic exits or statements. I answered messages when necessary. I stayed polite, neutral, forgettable. People underestimate neutrality. They think calm means empty. What it really means is controlled. I observed. I noticed how my father talked too much when he felt safe, especially about money. I noticed how my mother hated unpredictability more than loss. I noticed how both of them relied on the same story, told to different people in slightly different versions, about how they had been wronged by an ungrateful son. Stories only work when they're consistent. The cracks were already there. They just didn't know anyone was mapping them. My first move wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It barely registered as an action at all. I updated records. Years earlier, my grandmother had insisted I be listed as the sole executor of a small trust she kept quiet. It had been dormant, untouched. After the lawsuit, I reviewed every clause with a forensic calm I didn't recognize in myself. There was a provision, one my parents had forgotten entirely, that allowed discretionary review of past financial conduct tied to the trust's beneficiaries. It didn't strip assets, it didn't accuse, it simply triggered audits when credible evidence of manipulation existed. I didn't submit accusations, I submitted documentation, bank transfers, emails, text messages, patterns. Nothing emotional, nothing exaggerated, just timelines, numbers, repetition. The kind of evidence that doesn't shout but lingers. The review process was internal, confidential, slow. Weeks passed. Then something small happened. My father mentioned casually that his bank had asked for clarification on older transactions. He laughed it off, called it bureaucracy. My mother complained about paperwork arriving out of nowhere. I said nothing. I nodded. I watched the irritation form. Not panic, not yet, but discomfort. The feeling of being looked at by something unseen. That was my mini revenge. Not damage, pressure. They didn't know it came from me. That was the point. Revenge that announces itself becomes resistance. Revenge that hides becomes gravity. I learned something important in that phase. They feared exposure more than loss. Money could be rebuilt. Reputation could not. They curated their image carefully. Church acquaintances, extended family, old friends. Being questioned, even quietly, unsettled them in ways no courtroom defeat had. That was the weakness they didn't know I saw. They assumed I wanted closure. They assumed I wanted fairness. They assumed my silence meant I was moving on. In reality, I was learning how patience reshapes power. I was discovering how restraint sharpens intent. I felt something change in myself, too. Not excitement, not satisfaction, distance. Revenge doesn't arrive with adrenaline when it's done right. It arrives with clarity. I stopped replaying the past emotionally and started reviewing it strategically. I no longer asked how they could do this to me. I asked how they had done it before and how often. They celebrated too soon. I could hear it in their voices, the ease, the assumption that the threat had passed, that I had been taught my lesson, that silence meant surrender. They were wrong, because while they were returning to comfort, I was finishing my inventory. Every connection, every vulnerability, every system they depended on without realizing it could turn. I didn't rush. I didn't escalate. I waited until I was sure of one thing. They thought it was over. I knew it had just started.
Pressure doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It settles into routines. It changes the way people speak without them realizing it. I noticed the shift in my parents long before they did. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became forced. My mother started repeating herself, circling the same topics like she was checking for stability. My father began asking questions he didn't actually want answers to. Small ones, casual ones. Questions designed to confirm that nothing was moving beneath the surface. Something was. The quiet review I had triggered didn't stay contained. It never does. Institutions talk to each other without calling it conversation. Requests create records. Records create flags. Flags invite curiosity. None of it pointed back to me, but all of it pointed toward them. And once people who value control feel watched, they start making mistakes. I saw it in the defensiveness. My father suddenly volunteered explanations no one had asked for. My mother became obsessed with timing, when letters arrived, when calls came in, when emails were sent. They were still telling themselves it was coincidence, but their bodies had already accepted a different truth. Something had changed. Something had noticed them. I stayed harmless. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me wanted to tighten the pressure faster, to lean in, to force acknowledgement. But revenge isn't about speed, it's about direction. I kept my tone neutral. I remained responsive but unremarkable. I let them see me as static, as finished, as someone who had learned his place. How long could you pretend to be harmless if everything depended on it? I asked myself that often, especially when I felt the cost of pretending, because the longer I played invisible, the more I felt myself drifting from the person I used to be. I wasn't angry all the time anymore. I was colder, more precise. I started measuring people instinctively, how they protected themselves, where they overcorrected, what they avoided. Revenge was changing my identity, not in loud ways, but in posture, in silence, in patience that bordered on indifference. The consequences of the mini-revenge began rippling outward.
A distant relative mentioned my parents were under stress. A family friend asked vague questions about old financial things. My mother stopped posting online altogether. My father began double-checking statements he used to skim. They weren't panicking. Panic is obvious. This was something subtler. Suspicion, the fear of an unknown variable. And fear always looks for a face. They started watching me. Not directly, never directly, but I caught the glances, the delayed responses, the careful neutrality mirrored back at me. They didn't accuse, they tested. My father once asked too casually whether I had heard anything strange lately. I said no, and meant something different than he thought. Time pressure entered quietly. A deadline loomed, one I hadn't created but understood immediately. The trust review had a procedural window. At the same time, my parents were finalizing a financial arrangement tied to their long-term stability, a restructuring, a consolidation. It depended on their history appearing clean, predictable, boring. Any unresolved scrutiny would complicate it, delay it, potentially unravel it. They didn't know the clock was ticking. I did. That knowledge was heavy, not thrilling, heavy. Because once a countdown starts, hesitation becomes its own kind of decision. I felt the weight of it late at night, sitting alone, realizing how far I had already gone without ever raising my voice. I wondered briefly what it would mean to stop, to let it fade, to choose distance over consequence. Then I remembered the courtroom, the performance, the timing, the plan. This wasn't about punishment, it was about correction. They began acting paranoid in small ways. My mother stopped avoiding certain people. My father grew irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences. Control was slipping, and they couldn't identify why. When people who rely on narrative lose control of the story, they start fearing the truth, not because it's false, but because it's complete. I stayed patient, because patience wasn't passive anymore. It was leverage. And then, quietly, without ceremony, I accessed something they never thought I would touch. Not money, not property. Proof. A complete, verifiable archive. Records that didn't just show what they had tried to do to me, but what they had done to others across years, in patterns too consistent to be dismissed. Material that didn't accuse, it explained. I didn't release it. I didn't threaten it. I simply understood what it meant to have it, and in that moment, I knew something irreversible had already begun.
The first visible consequence didn't arrive with drama. It arrived as absence. A meeting my father expected to attend was quietly postponed. A phone call my mother was waiting for never came. Invitations slowed, responses shortened. People didn't confront them, they adjusted around them. That's how reputational damage begins, not with accusation, but with hesitation. Outwardly, I remained unchanged. Same tone, same posture, same carefully neutral presence. I didn't escalate contact or withdraw it. I let them project whatever narrative they needed onto my silence. Inside, though, I was tracking momentum. Because once consequences surface publicly, the direction matters more than the speed. They noticed. My father tried to regain control the only way he knew how, by confronting me indirectly. He didn't accuse, he didn't threaten, he framed it as concern. He asked whether I was holding on to resentment and warned me about letting things go too far. I listened without reacting. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. When people expect resistance and receive calm, they feel exposed. My mother was less subtle. She called late one evening, her voice tight, asking why certain people were suddenly distant. I told her I didn't know. I meant it in a technical sense. I wasn't the one pulling away. Gravity was. What they still didn't understand was that none of this had started recently. The revenge they were beginning to feel wasn't reactive. It wasn't emotional fallout from the lawsuit. It had been set in motion long before Part 1, before the court, before the inheritance, before they realized I had learned how to watch without being seen. Years earlier, when my grandmother had insisted on documentation, when she had quietly separated narratives from records, when she had taught me, without ever saying it, that truth only matters if it's preserved. I hadn't acted then. I had prepared. That distinction mattered now, because preparation doesn't announce itself. It waits for conditions, and conditions had finally aligned. Public consequences started surfacing in professional spaces they valued deeply. Not exposure, not scandal, scrutiny. Processes that slowed approvals, reviews that requested additional context, neutral language that forced explanations. The kind of attention that doesn't accuse, but doesn't go away either. I watched them struggle to maintain composure while answering questions they had never expected to face. They tried intimidation next. My father cornered me after a family gathering, his voice low, his words carefully chosen. He warned me about burning bridges. He reminded me of how things could get ugly. I met his eyes and said nothing. Silence, used correctly, feels like judgment. He walked away unsettled. Threats only work when the other person believes you still have leverage. They were running out of it. The inevitability began to show in small cracks. My mother started over-explaining herself to strangers. My father began rewriting stories mid-sentence. They were trying to outrun records with language, and language always loses that race. The more visible the pressure became, the more obvious it was that stopping it was no longer an option. Momentum had passed the point of intervention. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance widen, because as their chaos grew, my calm sharpened. I understood then that revenge doesn't feel like victory when it's done correctly. It feels like alignment, cause meeting consequence without emotion attached. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was witnessing. One afternoon, my mother finally asked the question she had been avoiding. Why is this happening to us? I answered honestly. It isn't happening, I said. It's arriving. She didn't understand, but she felt the weight of it. People always do eventually. By then, the systems they depended on had already shifted. Files had been duplicated. Reviews had moved from discretionary to mandatory. Conversations were happening without them present, not because of me alone, but because what I had preserved made it impossible for institutions to pretend they hadn't seen anything. That's the part people misunderstand about revenge without violence. You don't destroy people. You remove the structures protecting them from themselves. They tried one last time to stop it. A message, carefully worded, an offer to talk things through, an attempt at reconciliation framed as closure. I declined politely, not out of spite, but because the window for negotiation closes the moment consequences become visible. Anything after that is just delay. I walked away knowing something fundamental had shifted. The damage wasn't coming. It had already occurred.
The moment everything was at risk didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no single event that could be pointed to as the turning point. It felt more like standing on a frozen lake and hearing the ice adjust beneath your weight, not cracking yet, but reminding you that it could at any moment. I started to feel it in myself first. Sleep became fragmented, not from guilt, but from calculation. My mind wouldn't stop running scenarios. What if a record was misread? What if timing slipped? What if they figured out how to redirect the pressure? Revenge at this stage isn't fueled by anger anymore. It's fueled by responsibility. Once you set consequences in motion, walking away doesn't restore neutrality. It creates chaos. Everything I had built, my credibility, my anonymity, my control, was exposed to risk. There were days I considered stopping,
Not because I doubted the truth, but because I doubted myself. I wondered who I was becoming. I noticed how easily I could detach now, how efficiently I could compartmentalize fear. I questioned whether reclaiming dignity was worth reshaping my identity into something colder, sharper, less forgiving. If winning meant becoming someone you no longer recognize, would you still finish? That question followed me everywhere. The pressure intensified. The review processes intersected. Independent threads began aligning in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. When systems overlap, they amplify. That amplification was dangerous, for them, but also for me. Exposure doesn't discriminate. Once scrutiny expands, it doesn't care who survives it. I came closer than I'll admit to pulling the plug. Then the reversal happened. It came quietly, through a third party who didn't know they were delivering leverage. A procedural delay, routine, unremarkable, shifted the sequence of disclosures just enough to protect my position while tightening the noose around theirs. It wasn't luck, it was alignment, the kind that only happens when preparation meets timing. That delay saved the plan, because in that pause, something surfaced that even I hadn't fully anticipated. Confirmation. Independent verification of patterns I had documented years earlier. Not my interpretation, not my narrative. Objective acknowledgement that what I had preserved wasn't circumstantial, it was systemic. The emotional cost hit me all at once. I felt the loss clearly then, not just of family, but of the person I had been before all of this. The version of me who believed silence was weakness, who thought restraint meant surrender, who measured success in approval rather than autonomy. That person was gone, not destroyed, but replaced. I didn't feel proud of that change. I accepted it. Because revenge, when done without spectacle, demands sacrifice. You don't get to remain untouched while applying pressure. You trade innocence for clarity. You give up simplicity for control. And once that trade is made, you can't reverse it without losing everything. They began unraveling faster after that. My father grew erratic, missed appointments, contradictory statements, attempts to assert authority where none existed anymore. My mother oscillated between denial and accusation, sensing betrayal without knowing where it originated. They were no longer coordinating, and disunity, once it appears, accelerates collapse. Then came the moment they finally understood. Not fully, not in detail, but enough. I saw it in the way my father looked at me the next time we were in the same room. Not anger, not dominance, recognition. The realization that the danger wasn't external, it was contained, familiar, quiet. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. They knew who was destroying them, and they knew there was nothing left to threaten. Because by then, I wasn't reacting to them at all. I was finishing something I had already decided to complete.
The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. It unfolded in stages so measured they mistook inevitability for coincidence. A position quietly dissolved. An advisory role was paused. A long-standing association chose to review alignment. Each step was delivered calmly, professionally, without accusation. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. When systems decide, they don't argue. I watched it from a distance, not hiding, not celebrating. Distance had become my natural state by then. What mattered wasn't seeing them fall. It was understanding that nothing I did at this stage could change the outcome. The final pieces moved because they had to, because records existed, because patterns were undeniable, because institutions protect themselves before they protect people. My parents tried to speak to me once more, not together, separately. That alone told me everything. My mother framed it as heartbreak, as confusion, as betrayal she couldn't name. My father tried reason, then authority, then silence. Neither worked. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't intervene. Intervention would have implied control. I didn't have control anymore.
I had alignment. The final blow wasn't public humiliation, it was erasure of influence. Their names stopped opening doors, their opinions stopped carrying weight, invitations stopped arriving. The stories they had curated for decades lost traction, because credibility, once questioned quietly, rarely recovers. There was no scandal, no headline, just absence. And absence, when it's earned, is devastating. I delivered nothing personally. No confrontation, no revenge speech, no explanation. That restraint was deliberate, because the most complete consequences are the ones no one can accuse you of orchestrating. They didn't lose because I attacked them. They lost because the truth finally stood on its own. When it was over, truly over, I took inventory. What I had lost was permanent. I had lost the fantasy of unconditional family. I had lost the ease of trust. I had lost the person who believed silence was safety. Those things don't return. They shouldn't. They are expensive illusions. What I reclaimed mattered more. Dignity, control, truth. I reclaimed my narrative, not by rewriting it, but by preserving it accurately. I learned that patience isn't weakness when it's chosen, silence isn't surrender when it's strategic, and people who underestimate you because you refuse to perform your pain are often building the conditions of their own undoing. There was no relief at the end, only clarity. I understood then that revenge, done without violence or spectacle, is less about punishment and more about balance. It doesn't restore what was taken. It prevents it from being taken again by anyone, including yourself. My parents never apologized. They never fully acknowledged what they had done. They didn't need to. Consequences had replaced confession, and that was enough. The moral is simple, though it took me years to learn it. Prepare quietly. Document everything. Let people reveal themselves without interruption. And never confuse forgiveness with access. I walked away without announcing victory, without closing statements, without needing to be seen, because the loudest revenge I ever took was saying nothing.